Good morning, everyone, and welcome to welcome to those of you who are in the auditorium and those of you who are online to this AI panel event on highly infectious avian flu and the price of eggs. My name is Vince Smith, and I direct the AEI Agricultural Policy Program. And it genuinely is a pleasure to have everyone here, virtually or in person. Clearly, the price of eggs has been a political, and I apologize for saying this, hot potato issue for the Trump administration. And it's especially important to recognize the impact of the recent price of egg spike on American households, and especially low-income families. However, the avian flu epidemic also involves and brings into new focus a major issue which has very widespread implications for farmers, food processors, and every US consumers. That is the importance of US publicly funded and privately funded investments in agricultural research that will lead to continued improvement in agricultural productivity, food prices, and animal and human health. And that's a serious issue given the downturn, very substantial downturn, under previous administrations and the current administration in funding for agricultural research, which today is at 75% of the levels that it was at its peak, and less than what we were spending as a society in 1976, almost 50 years ago. To explore these issues in the context of avian flu, we have a truly distinguished panel. Dr. Barry Goodwin is the William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor of Agricultural Economics at North Carolina State University and AEI non-resident senior fellow. He will share his insights about the determinants of egg prices over the past decade and a half, and the impacts of avian flu pandemics on those prices. We're really thrilled to have Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo, the director of the Pandemic Center in the Brown University School of Public Health, here. She is a distinguished scientist whose contributions to her field are internationally recognized. And beyond her work in science, her work as an expert on public health has been widely viewed as of crucial importance, and she has served as an advisor on pandemic concerns to governments and public health sectors across the world. Dr. Kay Russo is an experienced veterinary scientist who works closely with private sector companies and institutions, both academic and otherwise. She brings special insights about the concerns and insights of the poultry and related industries to the discussion. It's great to have someone who spans the practical with the intellectual in this set of issues. Our fourth panelist, Robert Yarman, is the founder of Innovative Animal Ag. It is a think tank committed to facilitating innovation that continues to increase productivity in all areas of the supply chain for livestock-generated commodities. He and his colleagues have worked closely with the poultry sector, policymakers, and scientists on critical issues that affect the capacity of the industry to generate increased productivity and the abundance of poultry products. Before we hear from the panelists, just a couple of housekeeping issues. Each panelist will briefly share their initial insights about the issues, followed by a 45-minute discussion between them, chaired by the moderator. And that will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A session in which we will take questions from you, the audience, both in the room and, of course, online. And if you are online and wish to submit a question, please send it to the following email address: Tonga, Tonga, period, Ahokovi, Ahokovi, at aei.org. So with that brief introduction, I hope it was brief, I'm going to turn the issues and discussion over to the panel, beginning first with Dr. Barry Goodwin's perspectives and understanding of what's been happening to the price of eggs, both over the past decade and over the past 5 days. Dr. Goodwin.
Okay, thanks, Vince. What's up with the price of eggs? I think all of us know just about everything has been up. If you've been to the grocery store, you realize really what we've seen is extreme volatility in prices. I found this just a couple days ago. Egg prices set another record in February. So it's really, I think, a fairly simple story on the surface. It's the avian influenza, the bird flu, that's having a big effect on supply. I could look at egg prices over a longer run, and you see how they've just spiked in recent years. We had, coming out of 2022, we had the bird flu findings arising, and prices spiked, moderated, and then went up considerably again. But the good news is, in the last 2 weeks or so, prices have really moderated considerably. So it's a very volatile market, and we've seen these extreme price spikes, but the good news is things are coming down. Now there's reason to be concerned that prices may, and some of the avian influenza concerns and risk may increase as the weather warms and with migratory birds and this sort of thing. And we're heading into a period of time where eggs are used quite a bit, with Easter, of course, and Passover and things like that. But we have seen a moderation of egg prices, and you see they've sort of plateaued here, and we're still above where we were in 2023 and 2024. So these are the most recent prices that just came out. So, you know, the news is improving, at least, that egg prices have moderated considerably after being very, very high. And again, it's across all market segments, producer, warehouse, and at the store level, we've seen a big change. This is just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen prices moderate considerably. So, you know, the news is improving, at least, as we've seen it in the very, very recent period of time. There's a lot of variation as you go state to state. Of course, California has their own set of production standards, and with Proposition 12 and some of the requirements there that lead to prices being higher than what we see in the Midwest. And again, the volatility that we've seen, this is compared to raw milk prices. You can see just how volatile egg prices have been in the last year or so. It's just a significant increases that we've realized. So where does this come from? It's coming from the bird flu losses, the losses in the flock. And you can see here with the gray bars, this is where we've seen the egg layer losses due to bird flu. And if you look at the time series here carefully, you'll see that the price increases tend to be correlated with bird flu outbreaks. So it's not a surprise there. Since February of 2022, we've had 168 million birds slaughtered to contain the virus. 30 million egg layers have been wiped out just since January. So this is a problem that we're still in the midst of. Compared to January 1st, the cage flock in February was down 7.3%, while cage-free flock actually increased 1.2%, and the organic flock by 0.6%. The APHIS, which is the agency that's in charge of animal and plant health of the USDA, has confirmed 40 outbreaks in layer flocks in 9 states. And these are the states where, since January of 2025, where we've been realizing the outbreaks. You see Ohio's been hit especially hard, and Indiana, and my own state, North Carolina, has realized losses. We have a very large egg sector in North Carolina. So it's a concern with the losses in egg layers that we've realized. We see that actually production has rebounded, though. We're on track to where we were in 2024 and 2023. So the industry seems to be resilient and responding to these losses. And these are weekly eggs processed. And I think one part of this resiliency is the fact that we've had some very significant production improvements, some technological improvements. So you see the lay rate has increased very significantly since 2007. And we don't see the huge hits in production system. You see it there for 2025, but we have realized some rather significant production gains in terms of output per hen. Demand has responded to prices. I'm going to show you it's not that responsive. Americans like our eggs in the US, but we have seen some downward trend in egg demand responding to the very high prices. Part of that's a seasonal effect. You see, we saw the same thing in 2024. This is my favorite diagram of all. It's economists love to talk about elasticities, of course. The egg demand is very inelastic, meaning that we're not very responsive to price changes. And it also means that supply shocks are going to have a big effect on prices, and that's exactly what we've realized. This is looking at the percentage change in production each year relative to the percentage change in price. And it gives us an elasticity of minus 0.06, which is almost no response at all to the very high prices that we've seen. So consumers are not very responsive to increases in egg prices. Mitigation measures, and I'm going to defer to my scientist colleagues on the panel here on some of this, but I know vaccinations are something we're hearing a lot about. It's being contemplated as a mitigation measure. Quoting the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, she said, there was a long interview here recently in the Wall Street Journal, and she said vaccination measures are likely infeasible due to the labor requirements associated with that. And she also said in that article that 83% of Mexican vaccinated hens contract the virus anyways. So again, I'll be interested in hearing from my colleagues here as to whether those numbers are on target. February 26th, the Secretary announced a $1 billion comprehensive strategy to curb the avian influenza and protect the U.S. industry, and in theory at least, lower egg prices. This $1 billion is divided up. The USDA has dedicated up to $500 million to help poultry producers implement biosecurity measures. And they've streamlined some of the requirements for that as well to help producers who have been affected to get back in business as quickly as possible. The USDA has dedicated $400 million of increased financial relief available to farmers that are affected by the avian flu. So these are disaster payments that are being made to farmers who have suffered the losses. And they've announced measures to assist growers in receiving faster approval to begin safer operations, again, after an outbreak. And then USDA has provided up to $100 million in research and development on vaccines and other therapeutics to improve their efficacy and efficiency, which, in the big picture, I would say, and I'm sure Vince would agree, that $100 million is really a drop in the bucket in terms of research and development cost. Actions to lower prices. The USDA has said that they're going to remove, this is very vague language, but unnecessarily regulatory burdens on egg producers. And the example given was California's Prop 12. Now, I don't know how USDA will necessarily be able to change the requirements of Prop 12, but it's one thing that's been mentioned. And then considering import options to reduce egg cost. Eggs imported from Turkey and South Korea. And there's been mention of Denmark, although the politics of that situation, I think, makes that a questionable thing right now. And finally, there's been some, this is from an AP article here from a few weeks ago, are egg producers inflating prices during the bird flu outbreak to boost profits? I don't see any evidence of that myself as an economist. I think what we're seeing is just a very inelastic demand for egg prices responding to production shocks, supply shocks. But Democratic lawmakers and an FTC commission member are calling for a government investigation of egg prices. And again, I just put that up there to make you aware that there are these rumblings taking place. I don't see evidence that egg producers are necessarily inflating prices.
Well, thanks for that overview. That's really helpful. Robert, I'm going to turn to you now for a broader-based discussion of the major issues. that you see arising out of avian flu, arising out of this current crisis, or perhaps not so much of a crisis as we might be persuaded to believe by some folks. The floor is yours, metaphorically speaking.
Sure. I think crisis is certainly the appropriate word to use in this case for a number of different areas. But first of all, let me just thank you, Vince, and AEI for putting on this panel. I'm excited to chat with everybody today about this important issue. Just a bit about who I am. I run a think tank. I call it Innovate Animal Ag. We work very closely with producers and other stakeholders in animal agriculture on helping to push forward new innovations, new technologies that can solve big problems that the sector faces. And we have a particular focus on the poultry sector and on issues related to animal health and welfare. So obviously bird flu is something that's been top of mind for us recently. And the emphasis that I want to mostly focus on today is thinking about the long term. So as we just heard, egg prices spiked recently. They were the reason that we all came here together today. But this was not the first time that egg prices were in mainstream news in the last few years, right? At the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023, there was another supply shock due to the same bird flu outbreak that we're currently experiencing. So the outbreak that's currently ongoing has been going on for a number of years and has led to multiple spikes in the price of eggs. So the question then is this going to happen again? And if so, what are the steps we could be taking now to lower that risk and to mitigate that possibility? And when I speak to producers in the egg industry and folks that are on the ground, what I hear overwhelmingly is that we're not currently on track to ensure that this is not going to happen again. So thinking to the previous administration's policy response to bird flu, I think given that the virus has been around for many years, it has been unsuccessful in keeping down the price of eggs, it shows that the Biden administration's response was ineffectual, and what we should be thinking about now is how do we avoid making the same mistakes that we made in the past to prevent prices from spiking again at a potentially politically inopportune time, right? At the end of next year, end of the year after. So when you're thinking about this long term, egg prices are obviously a very important food security issue. There's also public health ramifications that I'm sure others will speak to more. There are important issues around animal health and animal welfare that I think Americans have shown that they deeply do care about. There's also matters of protecting small farmers and small business owners from the effects of the disease. Some of the proposals in Secretary Rollins' 5-point plan are positive. There's been also some proposals out there to increase the supply of eggs via other means, for example, lowering the restrictions on the use of surplus eggs from the chicken meat sector, which are subject to certain regulations that allows them not to be used as table eggs. But I think that's also a positive direction that we can move. But I think, again, thinking about the long term, the only solution that we have right now to be proactive and protect against future price hikes due to supply shocks is vaccination, because that will be a proactive protection of our flocks from being negatively affected by the disease. Things like importing eggs, increasing the supply, funding biosecurity, these are all good, but they are ultimately responsive. They are responding to a crisis that's already happened. Now, that's not to say that vaccination will be easy by any means. There's certainly massive logistical and political challenges associated with it. The biggest one right now is issues around trade. So currently, the way that many of our trade agreements with other countries are set up is that any sort of vaccination campaign, even if it's just for layers in the US, would open the possibility that our trade partners could ban the export of all poultry products, including chicken meat, from the US. Now, this is a very important issue because the chicken meat sector is a big exporter in the US. In that industry, about 15% of revenues are due to exports. And even more, a lot of that is parts of the chicken that Americans don't really want to eat, right? Like chicken feet exported to China, for example. The challenge of the setup is that, to use words that some others have used, we can be vaccinating a layer in Michigan and it would affect our ability to export a broiler from Mississippi, even though they're separate industries, separate flocks, and they don't really affect each other. So this is something I think is really important for the current administration to work out with our trade partners. The second big logistical issue is, of course, just the challenge of rolling out a vaccine and monitoring its effects across our hundreds of millions of layers and billions of broilers if we go that direction, which of course won't be easy either. But I think in discussions around bird flu, it's important not to be paralyzed by the complexity. One thing that I've noticed in discussions is oftentimes the challenges and the issues surrounding a potential vaccination campaign can take a front seat over what is fundamentally the right thing to do. And I think if you look to other countries, Mexico, France being two examples, there have been other countries that have successfully vaccinated to great effect. And these, in my mind, serve as a proof that it is possible. These issues are surmountable. And so I think I believe in our current administration and our scientific community and of our industry that we can figure out what the right thing to do is, and I think vaccination is that option, and we can aggressively pursue that option to the common good. Thanks.
Well, thanks. So now I'm going to turn to the scientists, rather than the economist and the policymaker, but to the scientists, and to Dr. Jennifer Russo. I'm sorry, that's the wrong way to say it. It's Jennifer Nuzzo. I apologize. What are your perspectives, Dr. Russo? Take me out.
You can call me anything. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I wish I weren't here to talk about this because this is a virus that we've been talking about for more than 20 years now, and it'd be nice to one day not have to talk about it. But maybe to pick up on your theme about sort of the long-term impacts, I think we are miscalculating this virus and how it's spread and what it's going to mean for not just egg prices and impact on our agricultural interests, but also potentially public health. Based on, I keep hearing sort of a hope, a wish, and perhaps a belief rooted in a hope and a wish that this is going to kind of blow over somehow. And I'm here to say that it's not going to blow over somehow, that this is really a long-term situation that we have to deal with, right? This is a virus that is entrenched in the environment in a variety of different species, an increasingly large number of species over an increasingly large portion of the globe. I mean, just the spread that we've seen in the last 2 years in particular has been unlike anything we've seen in the 20 plus years we've been tracking this virus. And so I think when we first saw the outbreaks in cows, there was this, I would characterize as an underreaction, in part because there was a belief that it was just going to blow over and it would just wipe through the herds and then it'd be over. That just hasn't happened, and it won't happen. And it won't happen so long as there's still a source of the virus in the environment, and it won't happen as long as we continue to have susceptible animals. And in ag, and I'm not an ag, and you can correct me, there will continue to be susceptible animals because new animals will be entering farms, probably faster on chickens, which have a shorter lifespan than in dairy, but nonetheless, they'll still be susceptible. So this is a long-term situation. And the numbers that you were showing in terms of the amount of money that's been allocated to understandably compensate farmers, I mean, those are extraordinary numbers. We're talking about almost $1 billion. That is going to be a recurring cost unless we have a sustainable strategy to deal with the threat that this virus poses to our agricultural interests. And it's been quite devastating, clearly, to poultry, and I would say increasingly it's going to be challenging for dairy farms and the other farms that it may find itself entrenched on. So just to say that these costs really feel like these stopgap measures that are not understanding that there is going to be a longer term need for protections and compensation. I would say that it's probably worth thinking about what's happening on dairy farms and what's happening on poultry farms quite differently. There have been some thoughts about, well, let's just kind of let it, wipe through, whatever. Just to say that, and you'll correct me also if I'm wrong, that this is deadly to birds. The birds die. The birds die very quickly. It just wipes through poultry farms very quickly. So that is fundamentally different than what we've seen in cows, where the cows may be infected and, maybe symptomatic, may not be. It allows people to be exposed, perhaps not knowing, perhaps knowing, but there are some disincentives to kind of dealing with that fact. So how we think about protection on farms, I think, has to be bifurcated based on the very different outbreaks that we are seeing on those farms, likely due to what the virus is currently doing to those animals now. In my view, we don't have a good enough understanding of how the virus is getting onto farms and spreading on farms. We use a lot of very broad terms too squishily to be operationally effective. So we talk about biosecurity. Are we talking about biosecurity, meaning the measures that we're using to keep the virus off of farms, to keep them from infecting flocks and infecting herds? Or are we talking about the measures to document that after the flocks have been depopulated, that it's now safe to repopulate? Those are two very different types of actions. If your goal is to keep it out of the flocks in the first place, we need to have a better understanding of how it's happening. We know there's a mix of factors likely, but if it's coming from wild birds, that's a much harder task to deal with than making your workers, wear personal protective equipment and clean their uniforms. Again, when we're talking about these costs and thinking about what this is going to mean over the long haul, sort of having more of a understanding of the drivers of these outbreaks. I would say that we have tools that we are underutilizing and tools that we need better research and development of so that we can give farms more options to protect themselves and to reduce the likelihood of this recurring long-term costs. So for instance, wastewater. Wastewater might be a good way to understand when levels of virus are in our communities at a growing level to the point where farmers may need to do more to protect their flocks, to protect their herds, because the likelihood of the virus entering into their farms is growing higher. We're poised to lose our wastewater surveillance come this summer with potential lapse in federal funding. So that's one tool that could be useful to help mitigate, again, these very high and recurring costs that we are poised to completely lose. We should be expanding wastewater because it doesn't require anybody to have anything shoved up their nose. It's just a tool that can be used to give farmers more information, more intelligence to know how to take protective action. Similarly, I think particularly when it comes to the dairy farms, we should be putting more tools in the hands of farmers to better understand whether their herds are infected, to better understand whether their workers may be exposed. And just the way that we have learned that testing yourself at home and doing so in the privacy of your own home may allow you to take action that you wouldn't otherwise take if it were coupled with more potentially punitive government intervention, we should be giving farmers more tools that they can use so that they can manage the situation on their own, as opposed to the alternative, which is, I don't want the government to show up on my farm. I don't want them to know that this is going on, so I'm not gonna participate. We need to give them more tools to be able to handle this because, at the end of the day, you have to believe that farmers want to do right by their animals and they want to do right by their workers. They just need more tools to do that and less punitive action. I would also say that we're talking a lot about the egg costs. I'm not an ag economist, but my understanding is some of the costs to the dairy industry has been mitigated by the fact that the animals largely recover, but maybe farmers, depending on size, may be compensated for lost milk production. But if the animals don't recover sufficiently, are able to sell off that animal for beef. I could imagine that the price of beef may determine the extent to which that's a long-term strategy as well. I continue to worry that we are under-calculating the risk that this virus is posing to the workers on farms today. That's my top worry today. Today, the occupational hazard to the workers who are on the farms who are being exposed to this virus today, they continue to be infected. They continue to be infected in the course of milking operations. They continue to be infected in the course of culling operations. We need more tools to protect these workers. And I have argued that we should be making vaccines available on a voluntary basis for the agricultural sector so that if they want more protection than telling people they have to wear very uncomfortable, hot personal protective equipment when they're culling in the middle of the summer, that there's just more options for people. My top worry is the recurring occupational hazard that this virus will pose. So far, the cases of infection have largely been mild, but I am here to tell you there is no scientific impediment that I see for this virus to not one day be mild. And we know that this is historically not a mild virus. We know people have gotten severely ill. There are a lot of interesting hypotheses for why some of the recent infections have been mild, but they are purely that, hypotheses at this point. And that doesn't mean that all future cases will continue to be mild. So my top worry today is the occupational hazard. I'm the director of a pandemic center. I'm also worried about a pandemic. I've been worried about this virus for 20 some odd years causing a future pandemic. I am so glad to so far be wrong in those worries. But I can't tell you that I will continue to be wrong. I hope I am. I really hope I am. It may not be H5N1. We've seen a lot of mutations in this virus. Some mutations are concerning, like the identification of a Tamiflu-resistant virus in Canada on a farm. If we lose a therapeutic approach, we lose our abilities to protect the workers that are being infected today, and then anyone else who may become infected with that virus. Mutations could occur. It could be, some souped-up version of an H5N1. Probably more realistically, if you talk to the virologists, they're more worried about this H5N1 virus combining with another flu virus, possibly a human flu virus, possibly some of the other animal flu viruses that are out there. We had 3 flu pandemics in the 1900s. We regularly have flu pandemics throughout history. People are worried that we're going to have another flu pandemic. I cannot tell you what the probability of that is. I will just tell you I'm more concerned about it now than I have in these last year than I have been in quite some time. Again, I hope I'm wrong. But the last time we were very worried about H5N1 causing a pandemic, we had a pandemic in 2009 that was caused by a different flu virus, H1N1, that probably had ties to swine farms, pig farms. That virus was fortunately mild and such that most people forget we even had that pandemic. That's a great scenario. That would be the preferred scenario. But again, not all flu pandemics are mild, and we don't always roll the dice correctly in order to get a mild one. So I am worried about that. And one of the ways that you prevent a pandemic from happening, it's hard to do, but one of the ways you do is you reduce the number of copies of the virus on the planet. Every time it replicates, there is the opportunity for a mistake to occur. Every time it replicates in another organism, there's the opportunity for reassortment if it's next to another influenza virus. So I'm worried about that too. But today, I'm worried about the farmers who are being exposed to the H5N1 virus that is currently circulating on farms and that we have so far not fully given enough tools to protect them. And again, if farmers or farm workers started becoming very sick and dying, I think all these economic issues that we're talking about would completely change. So.
That's really fascinating. I've got a dozen questions I want to ask you right now, but it would be very inconsiderate to Dr. Kay Russo, who's going to share her insights about where the industry is coming from and perhaps what is needed in the future in terms of public and private investments in R&D.
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Kay Russo. I am a veterinarian with clinical dairy experience and background in poultry medicine as well. So a bit of a hybrid, which never seemed to be relevant until this past year. So I was a part of the small team of veterinarians that diagnosed the first H5 case in dairy cattle in the United States. And today, my goal is to represent this H5 issue from a vet's perspective. And as food animal veterinarians, we're often tasked with ensuring the safety of our food supply while not compromising the health and well-being of the animals in our care. And we are the front line for diagnosis and prevention of animal disease and the barrier that zoonotic pathogens often have to overcome in order to reach the public. And prevention is absolutely key in food animal medicine. We use tools like vaccines every single day to accomplish this. Prevention works, vaccines work, period. Now, it's really easy to do my job and advocate for animal and public health when this mission is in alignment and supporting the economics and business as usual of animal ag. It is extraordinarily difficult when these two things are at odds. And this tug of war is what is dragging us below the surface with H5 influenza in poultry and in dairy cattle in this country. Now, the current H5 poultry outbreak began in 2022, as we previously heard, and now we have over 168 million commercial birds that have been lost, a disproportionate number of which, to the tune of, I think, 135 million now, layer hens have been lost since 2022. Now, comparative to the 2015 outbreak, we've improved our response efforts. We've improved response times, we've improved biosecurity protocols, and this has allowed us to reduce the incidence of lateral spread between farms. And so in the beginning of this outbreak, many of the situations of disease came from point source introductions from wild waterfowl. Now, that playbook changed, and it changed in early spring of 2024. When dairy cattle became the new and very likely endemic host for this virus. And the dichotomies in reporting and quarantine and general management of this virus were so disparate between dairy and poultry that lateral infections skyrocketed. We had, particularly in states like Michigan, Minnesota, and most recently California, where we see shared geographies between layer operations and dairies. California lost 10 out of their 14 million laying hens at the end of last year and the start of this year. And so that is obviously reflected in the egg prices in California, coupled with some of the regulations. Now, of the 39 million, layer hens that we lost in 2024, 28 million of those were the bovine genotype. 28 million. So that tells you that we have a new risk factor for this virus on poultry operations. It's no longer just wild birds. This virus has become promiscuous with mammalian hosts. Its playbook has changed, leaving our response book dated and ineffective in its current state. So spillover into cattle is no longer considered a one-off. We've now seen 2 additional point source introductions in Nevada and Arizona with the D1 genotype, which is derived from migratory waterfowl. And we're seeing increasing outbreaks from migratory birds into poultry as a regular occurrence. Indiana and Ohio have been the most recent hotspot for this in the Midwest, perhaps with unknown intermediate hosts. There might be mammalian hosts in there that we have yet to identify. Now, the problem is the epidemiology of this virus has become so complex that our ability to pinpoint inroads into facilities feels impossible. So we have seen USDA clench down on poultry, on biosecurity, but even shower-in facilities are succumbing to this disease. It feels a hell of a lot like we're losing right now. So thankfully, we've had a reprieve in the last couple of weeks in respect to layers lost at least, which have softened egg prices some, coupled with a reduction in consumer demand. But this virus has just slipped below the surface for the time being, and I would urge us not to get complacent. It will be back. It might be days, it might be weeks, but it's very unlikely to be months. We are out of time. And there's been a lot of misinformation thrown around that the previous administration killed all these birds unnecessarily. And while I do think the previous administration could have done a better job in managing this cattle outbreak, it didn't do anything extraordinarily different from what we've done previously in poultry and what we are doing now when a flock becomes infected. So what is that? We depopulate or kill, for those that don't understand that word, every bird on an infected site to take the fuel away from that fire, to stop the further spread and to reduce the chance for human infections and for mutations, as we just heard. But remember the dichotomy to dairy. The same virus, different disease, different playbook. This virus kills anywhere between 75 to 100% of the commercial birds it infects. They are always naive. And so depopulation is often the more humane route in infected flocks and infected barns. Now, what I can't accept as a veterinarian is we're not given the tools that we need to properly combat this virus, which now has multiple endemic hosts in the United States. If it was confined to commercial poultry alone, eradication would be successful through depopulation alone, but it's not. It's in wild birds, it's in cows now, it's in many different hosts. We need vaccines. And if we consider biosecurity as pickets in a fence and vaccines as additional pickets, our likelihood of keeping this virus out is far greater than either one of those approaches alone. And so vaccines, if they're used strategically, when we can use them when we need them and we can remove them when we don't. That's called an exit strategy. Every vaccine campaign with flu virus in poultry has an exit strategy. It's like putting your foot in the accelerator when you need it and pulling it off when you don't. And so I'm not going to lie that vaccines require extensive monitoring. We will still need to depopulate infected flocks, but if we use countries that have been successful with this strategy, like France as an example, the number of infected flocks will be reduced significantly. They reduced their number of infected flocks by 90% with their recent vaccine campaigns in ducks. Even when vaccines fail to prevent infection, we keep hearing we need sterilizing vaccines. Well, that's not going to happen. Even when they fail to prevent infections, they succeed at reducing viral load that can contribute to human risk and spread to other farms. This will reduce the load to our regulatory officials managing these outbreaks and the heartache to those affected. We have been given sticks as veterinarians in the United States to take to a gunfight and blindfolded by the lack of real-time county-level data on outbreaks in cattle, such as what is provided in poultry. We are blind to the virus and local wildlife in real time as well. Now, the sharing of metadata, which is basically the temporal information and the county-level information of where the virus is a tool that allows us to understand how the virus is moving and how it's changing genetically. This is also delayed by the government, sometimes by months, further blindfolding. The topic of trade as being a barrier to vaccination will likely come up today. And as a veterinarian, my oath is not to trade, but to the health and the well-being of the animals in my care and the public I swore to protect. And it's policies regarding the health of animals and public health should be kept separate from policies that dictate trade. Let me say that again. Policies regarding health of animals and public health should be kept separate from policies that dictate trade. We need more tools. We need to trust science, which has unfortunately become a dirty word these days. And we need more transparency. There are effective poultry H5 vaccines manufactured right in the heartland of the United States. In my professional opinion, we could pull those off the shelves and use them within days, if not weeks. We don't have a year to sit on this. We probably don't even have 6 months. We are gambling with and compromising animal health, human health, and food security in this country by stalling this further. And this does not have to turn into a human pandemic to be devastating. It already is. We need vaccines. We need more testing of all at-risk species. We need more real-time results to make decisions on the ground. We need more research funding, and we need transparency from the US government. We need to do better now. Thank you.
This is a fascinating set of presentations and raises so many issues that, as moderator, I don't know where to begin with the questions. But let me ask this question. We have heard, we have read, many of us have read in the Wall Street Journal and anywhere, the remarks of the current Secretary of Agriculture that vaccination has been ineffective in Mexico. Is that true? Is that false? What is the state? What is the genuine information we should take from what we know about Mexico?
Sure.
And
I can take that.
obviously, both of you could, yeah, both both of you can take this, meaning the two scientists who actually know what they're talking about.
I've spent some time better understanding the objectives of vaccinating in Mexico versus some of the other countries. And so it's important to understand the distinction. Comparing the United States to Mexico is like apples to oranges. Mexico has endemic H5 and H7 in their commercial layer flocks. And so their objective for utilizing vaccines is to reduce the clinical symptoms of the virus and reduce the mortality for the purposes of food security. When we vaccinate flocks to eradicate the virus, it becomes so important that we surveil for the virus. And Mexico does not have a reporting requirement necessarily. They don't have regular testing going on. And so if we were to employ vaccines, it would look very different. Because Mexico doesn't keep as close an eye on the virus circulating in the population, there's become a distance between the vaccines used and the virus that's circulating. This will drive pressure too, and you'll see increased mutation rates. But again, understand the objective of Mexico is very different from that of the United States. A more appropriate comparison, an apples to apple comparison, would be to compare the United States to France. And so to give you some context, France vaccinates 60 plus million commercial ducks every year. And those vaccine campaigns probably cost north of 100 million euros. 50% of that cost is for surveillance. And that is to ensure that they identify flocks that become positive for the virus, that they stamp those flocks out, because the goal of vaccination is still eradication in commercial poultry in France. So again, very different objectives between Mexico, which is largely food security for the folks in their country, and France, which is eradication in commercial poultry, and that would be more similar to what we're going to do in the United States. But again, surveillance is key, making certain that that vaccine matches the circulating strain to avoid driving infection and mutation. Those are all pieces of this that we will do a good job at to ensure that we are doing this properly. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I'm just struck that those arguments are very similarly applied when we talk about human vaccines, and just to say that reducing viral load, reducing severity of disease, decreasing the likelihood of transmission are all key goals of using vaccine, but no single strategy is going to do it all. It takes a bunch, and I think the key is to have a very clearly articulated strategy, like what are the high-end goals of using this tool? What does it get us? What does it not get us? And what additional actions are needed in order to get us closer to that goal?
So, Dr. Nuzzo, you said something that really struck me in terms of surveillance and monitoring. You talked about wastewater monitoring. And if I heard you correctly, please correct me if I misheard you, you said that funding for that from the public sector, presumably the federal government, will not be available at all or in much more limited ways in the coming months and years. Can you come back and talk a little bit more about that, please?
So wastewater surveillance, I think, is a largely underutilized tool. I mean, if there were any upsides of the pandemic, one is that we figured out that monitoring wastewater can be a useful tool. It's like a smoke detector. It doesn't tell you exactly what's going on, but it sounds an alarm that says, maybe you should look more closely, something might be happening. For H5N1, we have remarkably underutilized wastewater surveillance. So there are a lot of wastewater surveillance sites in the US. There's, in my view, not enough of them, but they're there. They're mostly testing for COVID, which is sort of useful at this point, but also there's other pressing things that I think we should be looking at. There was initial reluctance to start testing for H5. It has happened, but only a fraction of the wastewater sites that exist are actually looking for H5N1. To me, this seems dumb. If you're going to go and collect a specimen, test it. Test it for the stuff you care about. nonetheless, the wastewater sites, particularly ones through the National Wastewater Surveillance System, the funding for that may be overcome this summer, and it raises question of whether other sites that are supported through other mechanisms will also be canceled. You likely heard about the rescission to state and local governments for COVID-related funds. Sometimes this gets reported as, they were doing stuff during the COVID pandemic and we don't need to do that anymore, so we're taking back the funds. No, the reality is that funding was going to support people and infrastructure like surveillance systems that were useful during COVID, but also are useful for other things in our communities. And so pulling that back could mean a further loss in surveillance that could compromise our abilities to know. Again, we don't have a whole lot of ways to monitor H5. There is some, I think we should be doing more tests on farms. There's obviously some impediments there. Wastewater is the way to kind of sound the alarm, the smoke, have the smoke alarm go off so that we can ask more thoughtful questions without some of the disincentives that would exist testing in other ways.
So let me ask Dr. Goodwin a question now. I'm going to call you Barry because we've known each other for a long time. Yep. Barry, essentially, the price of eggs came close to doubling at the peak of the price spike for about a month. Is that about a fair statement?
Right.
In total dollars, what did that event take out of the consumer's pocket?
Oh, wow.
Or just back of the envelope.
Yeah, I don't know. We're talking in the billions of dollars, I believe. I mean, it's a huge impact. Like I said, Americans like their eggs, and so it's something that, and you did not see the huge demand response that you might expect with other goods. So certainly it showed up in huge increases in spending on eggs.
So let me follow up. From the numbers you shared about how insensitive egg buying habits are in the grocery store to changes in prices, it seems to me that all you need for a doubling of egg prices is as little as a 1 or 2 or 3% decline in production. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So when we come to talk about avian flu, if we take what some have described as draconian measures, killing any flock where the incident occurs, it does not have to be that many flocks before consumer costs in total get very substantial.
Right.
Is that correct?
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, it's consumers are not very responsive to these price changes. We've seen that. And, characteristic of a good like that is that small changes in supply and these shocks that we've realized certainly have an effect on price volatility. And we've seen that, and prices gone up, and they've come back down now as the industry's, at least in the short run, recovered somewhat.
So if having looked at the data that you presented, we've had 2 very severe price spikes over the last 3 years, which presumably have cost tens of billions of dollars in total, I'm guessing.
Right.
How much are we investing in agricultural R&D to address the relevant tools, in particular the viruses perhaps, but also other tools?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's certainly, as I said, a drop in the bucket. This $1 billion sounds like a lot, but you take the compensation out of that, and the research and development of $100 million is just minuscule, I think, relative to what's likely needed, which I would defer to the scientists on the panel here. But this is true not just of research and development as it pertains to avian flu and animal disease, but research and development in total has really been squeezed over the years in the Farm Bill and so forth. So we've seen how productive those funds can be in terms of raising the technological productivity of an industry. And I'd say if there's any shortcoming of government action, it's just not putting enough toward research and development.
So, Robert, you and Dr. Russo both talked about how easy it is to get policy in place when everybody in the supply chain, if you like to think of it that way, from consumer to farmer to processor, are aligned. And you emphasize that not everything is aligned.
No.
Can you expand on that for us, Jennifer? I'm sorry, Kay.
Yeah, you're good. I think, obviously, if we look at one of the major barriers being trade to vaccine, ultimately the industry that's disproportionately affected by influenza is not the one that exports a large amount of product. And so the industry that would be most negatively impacted by vaccines does not get hit with influenza to the degree that the other industry does. And so even in the poultry space, there is differing of opinion and back and forth on this issue. And so ultimately it comes down to those that are responsible for our trade agreements going in and making the distinction between laying flocks, turkey flocks, and the broiler industry. We need to consider them as distinct entities because we're not going to go in and vaccinate a bunch of broiler birds. That's not even a reasonable need, right? They are shorter lived birds. The degree to which they're infected is far lower than that of the layer industry. And so, being able to make that distinction from a policy level is going to be important moving forward so that we can use the tools where we need them. And as we consider this expanding host range as well, utilizing vaccines for cattle is also a consideration, and not one that I think we would have a barrier to in the field. As I talk to my producers, they'd be more than willing to implement a vaccine in order to reduce the productive losses that they experience, because if you look at that, some recent research has shown that the average clinical case of H5 in a dairy animal is about $950 a cow. And so that has implications, albeit for the shorter term, on these operations. And particularly if this virus is one that starts to hit these operations year over year, there is an incentive to vaccinating cows as well. Not only from that standpoint, but also reducing that viral load so that those folks that are milking cows and managing these animals are protected from excessive virus, because the milk has an extraordinary amount of virus in it. And as Jennifer alluded to, that's ground zero for a potential pandemic. You've got somebody that's milking cows and he gets sick from, one of his kids goes to kindergarten and brings home a seasonal flu variant. And then he goes to work and he milks cows and he gets infected by H5. Now that is your ground zero, and that will take off a lot faster before we can mobilize. And so really protecting the most at-risk folks, the animals that are shedding the most virus, and really mitigating that virus load that's spilling into the environment. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it's obviously a very convoluted issue. So
well, it doesn't hurt to have you repeat for people like me what you may have said earlier, because these are complicated issues. Robert, what's your perspective here?
So I think that when it comes to the coupling of all the different parts of the poultry industry, the egg side, the broiler side, the turkey side, I think the best thing to do and the most rational, in a way, response would be to decouple them, see them as different industries, because they fundamentally are. I think if that's not possible, for various reasons, if we look at the trade impacts on the broiler sector, that's also something that we measured in the billions. I think just based on revenues, it's about $5 billion exported each year. But I think there are factors that would mitigate the potential economic impacts of the trade issues from a potential vaccination campaign. One of them being, of course, there's the countries that we primarily export to are Mexico, China, and Canada. Mexico and China are two countries that already vaccinate for H5N1. So the worry of potentially importing the disease might be somewhat mitigated there. Also, these are countries where we are currently, there are some tariff escalations happening, and there have already been tariffs put in place for agricultural exports, which include broiler meat. So that could also affect the situation. I had one more point that I slipped my mind, but I think all these will
let
likely.
me follow up,
yeah.
because I know that Barry and I have both been very aware of issues with the export of beef to certain countries associated with beef hormone and use of antibiotics. A lot of those concerns come with respect to European countries, the European Union, and so on. So you're saying that those are not the markets to which we export broilers, at least at this time?
Not substantially. I mean, we still do export to other markets like that, but the biggest ones are Mexico primarily, and then Canada and China.
Let me follow. Give us a sense of the relative unimportance of Europe. Well, I'm not sure I want to say that, by the way, but in this marketplace, what percentage of exports go to Canada, Mexico, and China right now for poultry, roughly speaking?
I don't have the figures off of my head, but I think it's something like 30 to 40% of. Is that right?
Don't quote me on this. I want to say it's north of 3 billion are accounted for by those 3 different countries.
Yeah, and then there are other countries that take smaller amounts.
Yes, that's correct.
I'm just trying to get a sense as to whether or not the sort of issues that have come up in the World Trade Organization in relation to US relationships with Europe on beef, and with, to some extent, with Japan.
I don't think Europe is a major player with respect to importation of poultry products. And the other consideration here is this isn't just a US issue, right? This is a global issue. And so the fact that countries are kind of using this in trade wars is a little bit depressing, in my opinion, because if we don't control it adequately, then it has the impact to affect you. These birds can fly, right? And so it would behoove the world as a whole to be a little more open-minded on the utilization of tools like vaccines instead of weaponizing that, in my opinion.
So in terms of, just to come back to the planks in the fence post analogy and their costs, how much should the US be investing in research on avian flu?
All of it.
Well, beyond that,
I'm joking, sure. but right now it's still. I mean, we're not dealing with a pandemic yet. I mean, if you look at the cost, and you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, of what the COVID-19 pandemic cost the U.S. alone, I think it was north of $16 trillion. And so, if we were to tip into yet another pandemic, I mean, what we're talking about in investment to prevent it is pocket change.
And when you say pocket change, are you suggesting maybe $500 million a year should be going in to look at therapies to address avian flu? I'm just trying to push you a little bit on this.
Yeah, I think more than what's being invested is certainly appropriate. And it's not just therapeutics or vaccines. It's also the epidemiology. We have an extraordinary void in the epidemiology that has been performed in this current outbreak, particularly in the last year. Michigan's done some work, the state of Colorado has done some work, California's done some work, but the orchestrated effort to get folks in and working together across the different entities, whether it's local public health, local, state governments, orchestrating with USDA, orchestrating with CDC has really fallen short. And that's important because this virus has gotten so complex in its viral ecology that we can't figure out what the hell is going on boots on the ground because everybody's working separately. And so we need more money for epi work to characterize this. Otherwise, we're just throwing things at the wall and saying biosecurity, biosecurity, but we don't even know how this virus is moving. We have no idea. We have hypotheses, but maybe you could speak to this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I remember in the last administration, there was this announcement that they'd done this study, epidemiology study, to figure out how it was spreading between dairy farms, and really all it was they surveyed the farms that had outbreaks, and they asked the farms, what practices do you employ? And at the top of the list were we move equipment, we share personnel, and it was concluded, well, since those are at the top of the list, that's how it's spreading. As an epidemiologist, I'm horrified by that because, just looking at like the practices of one farm, like the affected farms, without comparing it to the farms that didn't get affected, I have no way of knowing, is that just like common practice? Or, they're not real serious attempts to figure out what is driving the spread such that we can use that information to stop the spread. We want more precision tools, right? We don't want these big blunt instruments. Many of the solutions that have been proposed here, the funding, are really to compensate losses. But are we going to do that in perpetuity? Maybe we decide that that's a fixed cost that we're willing to sustain in order to promote our agricultural interests. But I'm just saying, view it then as a fixed cost. Don't view it as this is something that's going to get us past the hump and then we don't have to spend this money anymore. Even talking about the trade issues, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that some of the hesitation about the use of vaccines, it's not about like contaminating the meat in the same way that some of the other examples that you gave are concerned about. It's about making it hard to conduct surveillance to know that if you have epidemiologic evidence of prior infection, is that from a vaccine or is that from an infection? Again, the birds largely die, so I think that issue is less of a concern. But perhaps one of the ways to address those concerns is through enhanced surveillance added on to the use of vaccines. In other words, countries may be worried about receiving poultry that have been vaccinated because they don't know, are they introducing the virus to their country, less about the quality or the contamination of the meat. That is not as much of an issue. And one of the ways that you can do it is improve surveillance on farms and perhaps have some confidence building measures that could accompany some of the vaccination use. But I'm just going to say, I think we need to do a lot more to figure out how this is spreading and how to try to reduce the spread. Otherwise, we're going to just keep accruing the costs over and over and over again. There'll be lulls in the activity, the viral activity, but this isn't going to go away. This virus has been circulating for 25 some odd years. The level of activity and the number of species that are now serving as sources of infection has just increased. So this is going to be a long-term situation.
So I'm trying to get my head around, and I apologize because I don't feel very smart at all about this, but I'm trying to get my head around a couple of issues. One is the monitoring issue. Give me a second. What is the monitoring issue which you have both talked about, and what that would cost, and what does that really consist of? One is, what's the role of bench science? And the other question is, and I think you've already answered this, but why not just let it burn, as it were? And I'm not suggesting I think any of these things are the right way to go, but if you could both address these issues, and I want to step back and just say, the only disease that's somewhat analogous that I know anything about, and I know very little, is what's called hoof and mouth disease here, foot and mouth disease in the UK, where if you don't report an incident, it's sort of go to jail and don't get out for a very long time for the farmer. And if it occurs, the whole herd is killed and you are disinfected for quite a long time. Now, in that, I'm guessing that we're not talking about that sort of approach, or should we be talking about that sort of approach?
So I can address a few of those, and I may turn it over to you to talk about some of the benchtop stuff. So in countries that employ vaccines, it's important that we enlist a DVIT approach, and that's differentiating infected from vaccinated animals. And so vaccines that we would use here in the United States and those that are used abroad in places such as France have distinct ways that we can test the animals that are vaccinated to ascertain whether the immunity is derived from infection or vaccination. So one example of that would be what we call recombinant vaccines. They only possess the H5 portion of the virus. And so we can go in and we can look for certain proteins, a response to certain proteins, like matrix proteins they're called, or the neuraminidase component. If we find that, we know that animal was infected as opposed to simply vaccinated. And so it's extraordinarily important that the vaccines we employ allow for us to also utilize that DIVA approach to differentiating the difference between infected and vaccinated. And that ensures our trade partners that the product that we're sending abroad is also free from virus. And we're not going to go through and vaccinate commercial broilers. We just aren't. And so if they test positive, and we do test them prior to slaughter within 21 days before slaughter for H5H7, if they test positive, we know that came from a field infection. And so that's one way that we ensure, and it's expensive. It's probably going to be in line with what we pay for indemnity and surrounding costs, which is to the tune, I think, north of $1 billion of what we spent throughout this outbreak. But consumers are only paying that, and they're not paying for it at the grocery store, too, when they're realizing the hike in prices, which is multi-billion. The other piece, I touched on the monitoring issue already. Again, France employs a robust monitoring strategy. They've demonstrated that their best surveillance is a passive strategy where they go in every week and test dead birds in a house and test them for flu virus. And so that has been the one that they've identified as being the most helpful. They also come in monthly and do additional testing on those flocks. So to just say we're going to vaccinate and not monitor is disingenuous. It's going to be a big piece of the cost associated with it. And then finally, I'll touch, before I turn it over to talk about the bench science, on the FMD. We're seeing FMD, foot and mouth disease, crop up in Eastern Europe right now. Hungary, as well as Slovakia, has had some recent outbreaks. The UK had some major outbreaks in the past. From a comparative standpoint, FMD would be analogous to high-path avian influenza in poultry. We handle it very similarly in poultry. We stamp it out. FMD is stamped out in cloven-hooved animals, which it affects. So it's going to affect sheep, goats, ruminants, and swine. And so what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll stamp out that virus, and sometimes they'll enlist vaccination in a ring around that area in order to reduce the viral spreading, because FMD is extraordinarily robust in its capability of spreading. It spreads on the wind. But the key difference between FMD and avian influenza is FMD is not zoonotic. And we are scared as hell to get FMD in the cattle in our country. Last time we've had FMD was in the 1920s in the United States. But if you look at how we facilitated the spread of avian influenza, or H5, I should say, because it's in a cow, through the dairy industry's movement, it shows a real Achilles heel in this country for our ability to spread disease. And so if we got FMD here, it would be extraordinarily, it would blow up overnight based on the amount of animals that we move. But again, the key difference here was avian influenza, or H5, was sort of the dress rehearsal for FMD, and we failed miserably. But I will argue that H5 is more of a public health concern than FMD any day. Mortality rates with FMD in cattle, 1 to 5%, higher in young stock. It's a production disease, it's a welfare disease, but it's not a zoonotic disease. And so I would argue that H5 is far more serious than FMD from the scale of overall potential negative impacts. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about some of the benchtop stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned before about just like letting it burn out. I mean, it's not going to burn out. This is an influenza virus. They don't burn out.
No, I
Yeah,
meant kill off all the
Right, yeah.
but yes, I get it.
In terms of the science that I'd like to be on, I'm going to turn back to thinking about humans, which is really more what I know about. There's a lot of really important questions that we need to know about this virus. I would love to take it off the worry list. One of the things that, there are a lot of these open-ended questions, like why have the recent human infections mostly been milder than what we have seen historically. Historically, of the 900 some odd cases that we have been able to count since we've been tracking this virus, about half of them have died. Most of that has occurred earlier rather than later. Why is that? We just don't know. There's an interesting hypothesis that the 2009 pandemic, which was an H1N1 virus, that N1 prior exposure may give people some protection. That'd be really great if that's the case. The problem is we don't know if it's like if you've ever had H1N1 or if it's what your first flu infection was. Perhaps that there's this concept of original antigenic sin that might be that the first flu virus your immune system encounters might set this kind of the tone for your immune system. So is the protection only in people whose first flu infection were H1N1? These are all really interesting scientific questions. I'd like to know more. They're really hard to apply to a population level, though, and thinking about how to protect people, because you don't know who you are, right? You don't know what your first flu infection was, and you don't know if you've had H1N1 in the past. Maybe you could do some testing. There are some questions about whether people have, whether there's this huge iceberg of infections, mild infections that we haven't seen, and perhaps that this virus is so much milder than we give it credit for. I will say of the very small amount of serologic studies that we've done, this is looking for evidence of prior infection, I will say that's largely not true. When they do serology studies in high-risk population, including veterinarians who were working with infected animals, they find that some additional people were infected. But it's like 2% or 7% of the study population. It's not like 50 or 75% of it. So what that tells us is most of us have not been infected with this virus. And if we all were to become infected, there's a lot of questions about how severe the illness would be for us. The thing that spooks me is the teenager from British Columbia who was infected, we don't know how, possibly due to wildlife exposure, was in the hospital for more than a month with very severe illness. And let me tell you, when I talked about like another pandemic could occur, are we ready for this sort of thing? Thinking about a flu virus, which, flu viruses typically preferentially affect kids and older folks. That's just historically, thinking about like what that would mean on our society. I mean, that is really one of the great challenges. That could be a differentiator, I think, from what we saw during COVID. So anyway, there are just a lot of like operational questions that we know. If we had better answers to them, it perhaps would allow us to more target our actions to protect farms and the workers on those farms. It also potentially could help take this H5N1 off the worry list.
Robert, this has been a fascinating conversation, largely around the science issues and the effect and the epidemiology of the disease. What about the politics of the disease? And where is Congress in the House, the Senate, and where behind closed doors is the administration?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the points I wanted to make is that I think we had a lot of good discussion around what else could we be doing, what other monitoring, what other research could we be doing. But I think when it comes to the policy response, the primary bottlenecks, at least to the vaccination side, are political and not research-based. So as someone already mentioned, we have facilities in the US already that are manufacturing vaccines that are used in other countries. So if we think they could be used effectively here in the US, the reason we're not doing that is not because we haven't done the research, although maybe there would still be more research to do, is because the political will is not yet there. So again, just speaking to the vaccination piece, it's really a agency issue. It's not something that would need new legislation. There have been moves from Congress around expressing support for this. There have also been moves from Congress around the proposal around surplus eggs from the broiler industry that I mentioned previously that would help alleviate some of the supply issues by just increasing the possible sources of eggs. But it's really USDA and USDA APHIS in particular that will determine the path forward here. And we've discussed some of the things that have been coming from that agency recently. Vaccines were a big part of Secretary Rollins' initial 5-point plan. There have been some other things said publicly recently that have been less positive on it. So we'll see what they end up doing.
So what are the costs? If I wanted to vaccinate a flock in the relevant way, how much would that cost right now?
So it depends on a lot of factors, one of which being what kind of vaccine it is. So there are some vaccines that are administered, for example, when the egg is still an egg, and there's a little embryo inside, and you can just do a little injection. Some are administered when the chicks are young and running around in a barn. Those can be a little more expensive. I've heard ranges from a few cents per chick to $1 per chicken. But I think the important thing is that when I talk to producers in the egg industry and I ask them, if you were allowed to do a vaccine, but you had to pay for it yourself, if the government was not involved, would you do it? Overwhelmingly, the answer is obviously yes. Because if you just merely pass the additional cost onto the consumer, and here we're talking, fractions of a cent per egg because each hen is going to lay 300, 400 eggs over the course of its life. Even if you just pass it on to the consumer, it'll be a fraction of the additional cost consumers have already had to pay because of the price spikes. And producers already vaccinate for a number of other diseases on their own dime. So I think it's economically, from the individual company's perspective, it's going to be worth doing.
So is that what the industry is actually saying now then? Because you have these contacts, you both have these contacts, and I don't. Well, I don't, and the audience doesn't. So I think we'd like to know.
Yeah, to be clear, I think there have been calls for the government to be involved in helping administer and monitor the vaccination campaign, and I think there are various public good and coordination reasons why this might be a good idea. My point was just that that's not strictly necessary, right? Even if producers were merely allowed to do it on their own dime, they would still likely do it. I don't know if anything.
So in terms of monitoring, and I haven't kept up with this, but much of the monitoring of animal welfare and animal safety and product safety issues fall with the Federal Inspection Service. What's happening with funding there? Because this presumably also relates to poultry. Do we know? Or is it a question?
Well, I think it's a combination. So I'm way over my skis here as a human epidemiologist, but from what I've heard in other sessions, it's a mix of federal and state-based, and states are varied in their approaches. Some states, like you referenced some of the great work that's come out of Minnesota and Colorado, those are particularly forward-leaning states. And so how much monitoring and what type of monitoring is partially determined on there. However, there have been federal programs. I will say I've separately heard in sessions concerns about the functioning of some federal programs, including because some people in key jobs are no longer in those jobs due to recent government efficiency actions. I will say as a human epidemiologist, and this conversation has been incredibly enlightening, I'm in a lot of sessions where we talk about H5N1. There are a lot of just kind of hands waved and declarative statements made about ag by people who know nothing about ag. And a lot of what you've said in terms of the fluctuations of the costs and what you're saying in terms of some of the actual actions on farms, I think aren't part of the larger strategy conversation. So I think we need more sessions where these, where the details, the very deep details of what the programs are, what the funding streams are, who is running them. I've even heard questions about whether the laboratory networks that the ag sector uses to even do the testing, whether that's going to continue to be functional because some of the funding changes and personnel changes. So I just think we need more facts from a part of the conversation that hasn't been part of the conversation.
And I think that's a key piece. When you look at avian flu in birds, it is a federally coordinated response. And if you look at H5 in cattle, it is not presently an overly federally correlated response. We've had some federal orders. A month after our initial diagnosis, they came out with an interstate movement federal order. They're slowly rolling out this national milk testing strategy, but it's really kind of difficult to understand where we're even at with that, because it's largely a state orchestrated response. And so states that want to get ahead of it, like Colorado, California, Pennsylvania, a list of states that want to get ahead of it have been proactive in testing. But there's, from a federal standpoint, there's not a real strict correlated response for flu in cattle. Now, you bring a good point up about laboratory funding. The tests that we run for avian flu have to flow through a laboratory network. We call this the NALN Laboratory Network, National Animal Health Laboratory Network, right? So there are a lot of the state labs will fall into that network. There's a few additional labs, but the samples have to go there to test first. And if they're positive, then they get sent to the NVSL in Ames, Iowa for confirmation. So there's kind of this flow through. And when we saw California, for instance, blow up, that lab got so inundated that they started to strike. And they couldn't process the samples fast enough in order to satisfy the need to diagnose this. And what does that do then? That handicaps us out in the field that are trying to respond to these threats. And so as we look at funding allocation, I would implore upon the administration that you put more funding into these labs, diversify the lab system, maybe like we did with COVID, privatize a little bit of it when we're seeing these spikes in order to adequately address the need for diagnosis so that we can respond adequately on the ground. So that's one thing I would certainly ask that and NALN, the coordinators for the NALN lab system were impacted by some of these funding cuts and personnel cuts, which can really cut us off at the knees at the field level when we rely on these results to make decisions.
So there are people around who would say, why can't the private sector do all of this, period? And Robert,
I just want it done. I don't care who does it.
But this is Robert, what really can the private sector do in terms of funding research? What are the needs in terms of public funding?
Yeah, so the private sector is certainly involved in this. The companies that are manufacturing vaccines right now are private companies, oftentimes with some government funding. I think the critical issue here, though, is that even if the private sector wanted to have a response, under the current regulatory framework, they would not be allowed to because of the impact on trade issues. The USDA would currently disallow companies from choosing to do certain things because of the impacts on trade. So I think right now, the issue is more that regulation is perhaps preventing the private sector from responding in the way that it would want to.
I don't think I may not have phrased the question correctly.
Okay.
Would the private sector be able to provide all of the funding needed for the science, monitoring, et cetera? Or is that feasible, or is that a ridiculous idea?
I don't think it's a ridiculous idea. I do think because there are certain aspects of the situation where what one company might do will affect the whole industry, there certainly is a role for government funding and government involvement in it. I think if it were merely privately funded, there would be classic issues of common goods being undersupplied. So I think there's room for growth.
Barry, can you talk about why so many economists who tend to be private sector oriented and market oriented still argue that that farms are not going to be capable of solving their own R&D problems by themselves?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic externality problem, and the contagious disease is a great example of that, where the catastrophic risks are so high and the transactions cost associated with that for individual farms. I mean, it prohibits the sort of investment that you need at an aggregate level. And then there's property rights issues as well, where private companies are profit motivated. They're not necessarily producing, first for the public good. But when you have a catastrophic risk like that, I think it's a classic case where there is a role for the government to be involved in coordinating and even funding the research.
So if you were going to sit down in private, at least, with the Trump administration, what would you say to them?
Well, I think we need more money for research and development, and I've learned today for monitoring, I guess. But certainly, I think there's not been enough of a response to that at present. And then there's the concerns that have been mentioned about losing key personnel and that sort of thing along the way as well.
So maintaining the infrastructure in terms of competence, knowledge base is pretty critical.
Well, I think it could be. I mean, I'm all for cutting fraud, waste, and abuse, like we all are. But where you draw that line, I think, is something that's being debated hotly right now.
Yeah, and this is a particularly urgent example of where.
Yeah, again, the catastrophic risks are so high that
Yeah.
and it's beyond what an individual can necessarily coordinate on their own. So.
Go ahead.
I have one comment on where I see opportunity is with point of care tests. We talked about a little bit about that as it relates to COVID. Because this is a regulated disease, there are some point of care tests that are available on the market for the avian and the swine space, but it has to be approved by the state veterinarian for use. Now, there are more tests that are coming out that are more molecularly based that can be conducted on farm, and that also can communicate those results with the state. And that's the concern. The government doesn't want people running their tests, finding out they're positive, and trying to hide it. But I see point of care tests as an opportunity to know your status before you move animals. Say you're moving, a flock to slaughter, and you test them right before, and they come up positive. And that mitigates your risk of processing birds that are positive in the early stages of infection. But there's been a real resistance to utilizing any sort of point of care test on the ground. So I would also ask that we look at that as a viable option, so long as the communication is there with the government, because this is a controlled disease, that if you're positive, you are identified, so we can work around that. So I do see an opportunity from the private sector to contribute some new technologies on that front.
The compensation schemes that are out necessarily play a role in preventing individuals from hiding this if they know they're compensated.
That would be the goal. But on the dairy side, because we haven't seen the extensive mortality, and that identifying yourself does impact your business as usual. And so some folks are like, I don't want people to know, because I don't want my business as usual, me moving these cows here and there and moving calves here and there, to be affected. Now that there's some indemnity offered for milk losses, folks are getting more used to it. It was kind of looked at like the scarlet letter, right? But now they're getting more accustomed to it, and that's not surprising early on with an outbreak. Not knowing if they're going to come and slaughter all your cows. Now that they're not, I think people are coming forward a little more, but that's the concern with point of care, is that the government won't find out. And so I think we can work around that, and I do think there's value on the farm for mitigating risk in the short term.
I completely agree. I mean, how many times we have to learn this lesson, the importance of giving people tools to make decisions.
Right.
Don't compare it to the gold standard of government's going to be involved, they're going to know about it, they're going to act swiftly. Compare it to non-action. And having some tools in the hands of people who can use those tools to make better decisions, better informed decisions, I think is far preferable than the alternative, which is, I don't want a government involved, so I'm not going to do it at all.
Right.
So I've got some questions from out there, not in here, but out there. Let me just ask one of these questions. It's for Dr. Goodwin. While the avian flu outbreak is clearly a major shock to the egg market, there are ongoing concerns about the level of concentration and potential monopoly power within the egg industry. Could you elaborate on your perspective regarding this? Specifically, what are the key metrics or pieces of evidence that lead you to conclude that market concentration is not the primary driver or a primary driver?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, certainly the concentration ratio in livestock markets, we hear a lot about it in the beef cattle and the pork markets as well. You have to weigh concentration concerns and market power concerns against the fact that there's significant economies of scale in these industries that make larger more efficient in a lot of cases. And so, I think we have not seen, in spite of what you hear all the time, huge increases in the last 20 years or so in the CR4, the concentration ratios. They're high, but they've been at those levels. And I think that the research that I'm familiar with, that's been done specifically in cattle markets, suggests more that we're seeing the effects of lower prices through economies of scale. So I'm less concerned with that. And as I said, I think there's good economic explanations for what we've seen in the egg market without having to go to some conspiracy to inflate prices necessarily.
Let me just have a quick follow-up for you. The Biden administration and some people in the Trump administration have claimed it's massive price gouging and it's sort of wicked behavior. Is there really much evidence of that?
No, I mean, I don't think so from the data I've looked at. But again, I mean, the Biden administration was, had an initiative to improve the competitive structure of livestock industries and that sort of thing. And they did roll out a few new changes to the Packers and Stockyards Act, but no major changes really in what's taking place. And no, I mean, I think we can explain. I wouldn't totally say that there's no evidence, but I think there's plenty of evidence that we're seeing that a classic, very inelastic demand supply responded to supply shocks. And prices have moderated. If it's to their best interest to raise prices, why are they coming back down now?
Well, I'm sort of a Chicago economist, and if you've got more than 4 firms in the industry competing, that tends to me to seem like there's lots of competition. But not everybody has that view. But
Contestable markets, I mean.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? Yes, Jerry. Dr.
Use your microphone. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Jerry Hagstrom, the Hagstrom Report. There's one name that hasn't been mentioned this morning, the Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. I'm wondering what members of the panel think about his statements and the fact that Secretary Rollins has said she doesn't disagree with him. And if you do disagree with him, do you see any way to counter the impact that his statements have?
Who would like to take this?
I can start. So he's made a few statements. The first being that we should let this virus burn through flocks. And while I appreciate the administration's interest in looking outside the box strategically, this will not work here. It's not a viable strategy. And that's because the mortality rate of this virus in commercial birds ranges anywhere between 75 to 100%. And so if you think egg prices were expensive before, letting this virus move through those flocks and kill all of the birds, your eggs are going to be very expensive. Not only that, but allowing that to happen also provides unnecessary risk to those folks that are dealing with these outbreaks because this virus is a zoonotic virus. Every time it moves into a new host, it has the opportunity to mutate. And so ultimately allowing that virus to move from bird to bird to bird, one bird is a generation time for this virus, one bird. Our generation time as humans is 20 to 30 years when we decide to have a baby. For birds, the generation time is anywhere from your pedigree flock all the way down to your commercial birds, 3 to 5 years, maybe more. The generation time for this virus is 1 bird. So if we were to just let it blow through and try to pick birds based on natural selection, that would take many, many years. And by the time we picked birds that perhaps were resistant to the virus through traditional methods, those birds might not even be resistant anymore. And so there's a couple of different counter arguments for that strategy, but number one is this is highly pathogenic, okay, and just major risk factor for humans as well. He's also made comments that the utilization of vaccines will drive mutation. And while we understand that these viruses are RNA viruses, they make a lot of mistakes when they divide themselves, and immunity, whether that's vaccine-derived or immunity derived from natural exposure, can drive some mutation in those viruses. The key in utilizing vaccines in this country is that we would surveil for the circulating virus, make certain that that vaccine matches that virus, and we will continue to depopulate flocks that become infected. So even if it does drive mutation, that virus stops there. And so again, the fact that we're using that as a barrier to utilizing vaccine, I think is an inappropriate one. Did you have anything to add?
And maybe just a comment on the human health side. So, people ask me, like, how ready would we be for an H5N1 pandemic? Well, we don't know what the next pandemic is going to be. It could be a mutated version of H5N1, though most people think it's probably a recombination of different flu viruses. Nonetheless, we've been planning for an H5N1 pandemic for decades and have in the stockpile, or still hopefully today, have in the stockpile products that could be helpful in a future pandemic, including vaccines in various levels of kind of readiness. Again, don't know if those vaccines are going to work against whatever the pandemic virus is because it's got to change in some way, but nonetheless, it's not like at the start of COVID where we had no idea if we were going to have anything. My worry is recent changes imperil even that, right? We are seeing a question of, first of all, cancellation of contracts that would diversify the pipeline for producing and manufacturing flu vaccines. So the best case scenario, if a pandemic happened today and it was even very close to what we have stockpiled, we would still not have enough for everybody. It would take time to get more vaccines for the people who would want it. Most of the vaccines we make are grown in eggs, right? So you could see a challenge there. So one of the reasons why they were pursuing contracts with mRNA companies was to just diversify, just to put more pokers in the fire so that we have fewer points of failure than we might otherwise have. Those vaccine contracts are, imperiled. There's, I think, questions about whether we would be willing and to what extent to make the vaccines that we have available. Again, I think we have them. I think we should be offering them to the agricultural sector. Finland is doing that. Again, I think it's an occupational protection. So then there's also questions about moving the stockpile and rearranging all of the organizations. And I will just say, if you talk to anybody who's in HHS, any of the HHS agencies, there is just so much chaos and upheaval right now that I am really worried that like the day-to-day stuff that we would need to get done to prepare for a pandemic is just not happening in part. So I don't know when or if the pandemic will occur. Like I said, it may not come from this whole virologic scenario. It may come from something else. I do know there's going to be another one, and I think, we don't often get advance warning, so maybe we should be examining what we have and trying to figure out if we have all the tools we need or if there's other ones we wish to have.
One of the questions that came in from beyond the room was, is there a role for artificial intelligence in improving monitoring, in addressing the impacts of this disease?
Yeah, I mean, sure. That's a very broad question, and I could think of it used in a bunch of different ways, from just kind of improving the collation of data sets to potentially going through some scenarios, some combinatorial scenarios. Sure, I don't yet see a path where that's like going to fix all of our problems, but.
Let me change the question a little bit.
I'm not an AI expert,
No,
so
that's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine. I mean, I'm not.
yeah,
Let me rephrase
yeah.
it. To have an effective epidemiological approach to monitoring, do you need to check every flock, or is sampling an approach that you can utilize?
I think we need more testing, and I'm going to say that term broadly, and that includes environmental testing through wastewater. And no, I don't think it has to be every. I think it can be more representative, but we're not even doing that. And whether you want to, first you have to do that in order to then apply the analytics to the data to make predictions based on what you have. But right now, the core data set that we have is I think far too limited for what the questions are that we would need to answer upon which we would apply AI.
And we do test most every commercial flock through the MPIP program. We have a setup distinction for evaluating for low-path avian influenza and high-path avian influenzas. We also have the benefit, or we shouldn't say benefit, of a very clear clinical indicator when flocks are affected by high-path. I think where modeling might come in is with some of the surveillance strategies, some of the vaccine looking at the immune modeling, and also migratory waterfowl monitoring to understand your real-time risk of where the migratory birds are in relation to your farm at any given minute, to understand what your risk is from a spillover event, which there is some of that is ongoing. So I certainly think that AI would contribute to this, and by that I mean artificial intelligence, as we look at sort of the holistic requirement. From a testing perspective, there needs to be more testing of dairy cattle and beef cattle. We've kind of gone like this with beef cattle, right? But ultimately, they are cows, and they are likely susceptible to this virus as well. And so from a more testing standpoint, dairy cattle, beef cattle, swine, all of these susceptible hosts, we should be doing more testing to understand our risk.
And making the data that you're talking about from these tests available such that we can actually aggregate them.
A lot of it's kind of hoarded right now by the governmental entities. There's some sharing, as I understand it, between USDA and CDC to look for human risk for the circulating virus. But there's a hell of a lot of smart folks, scientists that are not within those agencies that could help with this effort if they are giving more real-time data and metadata. They dump the sequences, but that metadata doesn't come with it. There's a delay. So I think we can certainly capitalize on both, private sector, university folks, and things like that.
So why is this data not being made public? Are there national security issues, for example?
They're saying because of privacy concerns for the producer. But on the poultry side, that data is given in real time. They do give information for outbreaks at the county level so that we understand within a given geography what the risk is for surrounding operations. Then they'll dump that sequence, and but that metadata associated with that sequence, even if it's poultry, takes a while. And that kind of blinds us to what that circulating strain is, if there's any mutations we need to be concerned about. Do our vaccines that we have in stockpile match that circulating strain? We need to be more agile with this, and we're kind of blindfolded from the private standpoint.
I've got time for one more question from the audience, if there's a burning question. And if there is a burning question, great.
Jerry Hagstrom again. From what you said about the possibility of the cattle getting both avian influenza and FMD, Dr. Russo, I'm wondering, do you think we move cattle around the country too much?
Well, we have, as an industry, over time, sort of evolved to the standpoint where we are relying on this movement. And so if I try not to look back too much, because it's hard for me to dwell back there, because I do think there were some missteps. But I think there is value in looking back from this standpoint. And we left animal movement open coming out of Texas. And the purpose of doing so was because the welfare implications of grounding animal movement. And so the state veterinarians had to make a decision. Is my risk greater in stopping animal movement from a welfare standpoint, or is my risk greater from a disease standpoint? Unfortunately, that leaving animal movement open facilitated the spread of this virus. Now we're at 17 different states, close to 1,000 dairies affected, which is a gross underestimate to the actual number of dairies that have been afflicted by this virus due to underreporting. So ultimately, I think we need to look back at that as a case study and understand in a future outbreak, because there will be future outbreaks, if, say, FMD hits our shores again, what do we need to do in the hours and the days and the weeks after that incursion in order to prevent the scenario that we've seen play out before our eyes this past year? And so talking up here from the cheap seats is easy, but I think there is value in looking back for that reason. We can't wave our wand and change the production systems overnight, but I would also encourage the industries, the dairy industry explicitly, to look at this and say, hey, what can we do differently moving forward? Because we have progressed in such a way to maximize production, and it's very obvious that maximizing of production came at a cost to disease prevention. So what do we need to move forward to prevent this in the future? Long answer. Sorry.
Well, that's a great note. We're almost out of time. Let me just ask each of you to give me a 1-minute comment on where you think, and in many ways you've already shared these perspectives, but what's your highest priority for the federal government and the industry? You've each got a minute, not 10.
Yes, sir?
So I'll just go down the list. Yeah.
All right. So going back to long term, what would a potential vaccination campaign look like in the US for layers? Hard to say exactly. We don't know what the vaccine candidate would be, but likely it would involve vaccinating layers at the time they enter the supply and not vaccinating adult layers, because that's significantly more challenging. Egg-laying hens live around 18 months. That's their production cycle, which means that to turn over the whole flock, it would take around, let's say, 18 months, 2 years. And if you look ahead, what happens in 18 months from now? Midterm elections. So I think if we're thinking about egg prices from a political point of view, and we're thinking, how do we guarantee that all these issues we're talking about, including egg prices, will not come up again? We have to act now, and I think vaccination is the most important.
That's your minute.
Great.
All right, I'm writing it down so I can be succinct.
Well, we can skip to...
No, I've got it. So as a list, I would say more testing, more surveillance of all at-risk species, more lab funding, more investment in point-of-care technologies. And then finally, the consideration of vaccines, again, for all at-risk species. So birds, cows, pigs, and humans. Less than a minute.
Oh, impressive.
Surveillance. I mean, I think we need to track this virus in order to answer questions, in order to prompt actions. And I've already mentioned wastewater. I think that's one area. It would be a shame to kind of have that infrastructure erode due to a funding lapse. I think we should be expanding it. It's relatively low cost for what it provides. I do think we need surveillance in other forms. I think it's ridiculous that clinicians can't easily figure out if their patients have H5 versus other flu viruses. While we're still in this period of trying to understand what risk this virus poses to humans, figuring out which flu virus someone has is key. During a pandemic, it will be less so, but certainly now it is. And so I think just putting more tools in the hands of people who need those tools. And I would just echo the earlier conversation about point-of-care tests on farms.
Barry.
Yeah, and I just repeat, I guess what's already been emphasized, but more funding for research and development, I think, is critical, and not just in this particular case, but as public agricultural research and development funding goes. We've seen significant erosion of that over time. And as you know, Vince, our research tells us that there's very significant returns to every dollar spent on research and development in agriculture, even on the public side. And I think there's clearly a role for government here to do a little more.
What about the private industry? Is there a role for them to do more as well?
Sure, I think so. I mean, they're certainly motivated by their shareholders to do more. And I think there's yet, though, I don't think private industry in this case is actually, I believe in markets and markets work, but there are cases where government coordination is needed, and this has all the characteristics of something like that. So,
well, let me just say this has been a panel where I have learned more than in any other panel I've managed to moderate, and I so appreciate the insights that you bring to us from the science, the regulatory perspective, and a little bit of economics. And thank you so much, each and every one of you. And thank you to the audience. This is one of the sort of joys of being at the American Enterprise Institute. This institution will bring objective, science-based, evidence-based perspectives to bear on critical issues. And this is one of the critical issues associated with American agriculture and human health. So thank you all very much.